CHAPTER II Part I of American Men of Action by Burton Egbert Stevenson recording is in the public domain. William Tomcho The Beginners Part I Nearly 500 years ago, there lived, in the beautiful old Italian city of Genoa, a poor wool comber named Domenico Colombo, and about 1446 a son was born to him and to his wife Susanna, and in due time christened Cristoforo. The world into which the child was born was very different to the one in which we live. Europe was known, and northern Africa and western Asia, but to the east stretched the fabulous country of the Grand Khan, Cathay, Cipango, and farthest Ind, while to the west rolled the Sea of Darkness, peopled with unimaginable terrors. Of the youth of Christopher Columbus, as we call him, little is known. No doubt it was much like other boyhoods, and one likes to picture him, in such hours of leisure as he had, strolling about the streets of Genoa, listening to the talk, staring in at the shop windows, or watching the busy life in the harbor. That the latter had a strong attraction for him there can be no doubt, for though he followed his father's trade till early manhood, he finally found his real vocation as a seaman. It was on the ocean that true romance dwelt, for it led to strange lands and peoples, and no one knew what wonders and mysteries lay behind each horizon. It was there, too, high courage was developed, and endurance, for it was there that men did battle hand to hand with nature's mightiest forces. It was the one career of the age which called to the bold and adventurous spirit. What training Columbus received, or what voyages he made, we know not, but when, at about the age of 30, he steps into the light of history, it is as a man with a wide and thorough knowledge of both the theory and practice of seamanship, a man, too, of keen mind and indomitable will, and with a mighty purpose brooding in his heart. It was natural enough that his eyes should turn to Portugal, for Portugal was the greatest seafaring nation of the age. Her sailors had discovered the Madeira Islands, and crept little by little down the coast of Africa, rounding this headland and that, searching always for a passage to India, which they knew lay somewhere to the east, until at last they had sailed triumphantly around the Cape of Good Hope. It is worth remarking that Columbus's brother, Bartholomew, of whom we hear so little, but who did so much for his brother's fame, was a member of that expedition, and Columbus himself must have gathered no little inspiration from it. So to Lisbon Columbus went, and his ardent spirit found a great stimulus in the adventurous atmosphere of that bustling city. He went to work as a map maker, marrying the daughter of one of the captains of Prince Henry the Navigator, from whom he secured a great variety of maps, charts, and memoranda. His business kept him in close touch with both mariners and astronomers, so that he was acquainted with every development of both discovery and theory. In more than one mind, the conviction was growing up that the eastern shore of Asia could be reached by sailing westward from Europe, a conviction springing naturally enough from the belief that the earth was round, which was steadily gaining wider and wider acceptance. In fact, a Florentine astronomer named Toscanelli furnished Columbus with a map showing how this voyage could be accomplished, and Columbus afterwards used this map in determining his route. That the idea was not original with Columbus takes nothing from his fame. His greatness lies in being the first fully to grasp its meaning, fully to believe it, fully to devote his life to it. For the last measure of a man's devotion to an idea is his willingness to stake his life upon it as Columbus staked his. The idea possessed him, there was room in him only for a dogged determination to realize it, to trample down such obstacles as might arise to keep him from his goal. And obstacles enough there were, for many years of waiting and disappointment lay before him, years during which, a shabby and melancholy figure, laughed at and scorned, mocked by the very children in the streets, he begged his way from court to court, to offer to princes the discovery of a world. And here again was his true greatness, that he did not despair, that his spirit remained unbroken and his high heart still capable of hope. Yet let us not idealize him too much. The eagerness to reach the Indies was wholly because of the riches which they possessed. The spice trade was especially coveted, and tradition told of golden cities of fabulous wealth and beauty which lay in the country to the east. The great motive behind all the early voyages was hope of gain, and Columbus had his full share of it. Yet there grew up within him, in time, something more than this a love of the project for its own sake. Though to the very last, a little overbalanced, perhaps, by his great idea, he insisted upon the rewards and honors which must be his in case of success. With his route well outlined and his plans carefully matured, Columbus turned naturally to the King of Portugal, John II., as a man interested in all nautical enterprise, and especially interested in finding a route to the Indies. That crafty monarch listened to Columbus attentively, and was evidently impressed, for he took possession of the maps and plans which Columbus had prepared, under pretence of examining them while considering the project, placed them in the hands of one of his own captains, and dispatched him secretly to try the route. That captain, whose name has been lost to history, must afterwards have been chagrined enough at the manner in which he missed immortal fame, for, after sailing a few days to the westward, he turned back and reported to his royal master that the thing could not be done. His was not the heart for such an enterprise. Columbus, learning of the king's treachery, left the court in disgust, and sending his brother Bartholomew to lay the plan before the King of England, himself proceeded to Spain, whose rulers, Ferdinand and Isabella, were perhaps the most enlightened of the age. Of Bartholomew's adventures in England little is known. One thing alone is certain: England missed the great opportunity just as Portugal had, and for long years it seemed that in Spain Columbus would have no better fortune. The Spanish monarchs listened to him with interest, as who would not, and appointed a council of astronomers and map makers to examine the project and to pass upon its feasibility. This council, not without the connivance of the king and queen, who were absorbed in war with the Moors, and who, at the same time, did not wish the plan to be taken elsewhere, kept Columbus waiting for 6 years, alternating between hope and despair, and finally reported that the project was vain and impossible of execution. Indignant at thought of the years he had wasted, Columbus determined to proceed to Paris, to seek an audience of the King of France. His wife was dead, and he started for Palos, with his little son Diego, intending to leave the boy with his wife's sister there, while he himself journeyed on to Paris. Trudging wearily across the country, they came one night to the convent of La Rabida, and Columbus stopped to ask for a crust of bread and a cup of water for the child. The prior, Juan Perez de Marchena, struck by his noble bearing, entered into conversation with him, and was soon so interested that he invited the travelers in. Marchena had been Isabella's confessor, and still had great influence with her. After carefully considering the project which Columbus laid before him, he went to the queen in person, and implored her to reconsider it. His plea was successful, and Columbus was again summoned to appear at court, a small sum of money being sent him so that he need not appear in rags. The Spanish monarchs received him well, but when they found that he demanded the title of admiral at once, and, in case of success, the title of viceroy, together with a tenth part of all profits, resulted from either trade or conquest, they abruptly broke off the negotiations, and Columbus, mounting a mule which had been given him, started a second time for Paris. He had proceeded 4 or 5 miles, in what sadness and turmoil of spirit may be imagined, when a royal messenger, riding furiously, overtook him and bade him return. His terms had been accepted. This is what had happened. In despair at the departure of Columbus, Louis de Santangel, receiver of the revenues of Aragon, and one of the few converts to his theories, had obtained an audience of the queen, and pointed out to her, with impassioned eloquence, the glory which Spain would win should Columbus be successful. The queen's patriotic ardor was enkindled, and when Ferdinand still hesitated, she cried, "I undertake the enterprise for my own crown of Castile. I will pledge my jewels to raise the money that is needed." Santangel assured her that he himself was ready to provide the money, and advanced 17,000 florins from the coffers of Aragon, so that Ferdinand paid for the expedition after all. It is in no way strange that the demands of Columbus should have been thought excessive. Indeed, the wonderful thing is that they should under any circumstances have been agreed to. Here was a man, to all appearances a penniless adventurer, asking for honors, dignities, and rewards which any grandee of Spain might have envied him. That they should have been granted was due to the impulsive sympathy of Isabella and the indifference of her royal consort, who said neither yes nor no; though, in the light of subsequent events, it is not improbable that the thought may have crossed his mind that royal favor may always be withdrawn, and that the hand which gives may also take away. But though Columbus had triumphed in this particular, his trials were by no means at an end. The little port of Palos was commanded by royal order to furnish the new admiral with two small vessels known as caravels. This was soon done, but no sailors were willing to embark on such a voyage, the maddest in all history. Only by the most extreme measures, by impressment and the release of criminals willing to accompany the expedition in order to get out of jail, were crews finally provided. A third small vessel was secured, and on the morning of Friday, August 3, 1492, this tiny fleet of three boats, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina, whose combined crews numbered less than 90 men, sailed out from Palos on the grandest voyage the world has ever known. The shore was lined with people, weeping and wringing their hands for the relatives and friends whom they were sure they would never see again, and most of the sailors were certain that they were bidding farewell forever to their native land. Even at the present day, few men would care to undertake such a voyage in such ships. The two little caravels, Nina and Pinta, were decked only at stern and prow. The Santa Maria was but little larger, her length being only about 60 feet, and all three of the vessels were old, leaky, and in need of frequent repairs. The map which Toscanelli had given Columbus years before showed Japan lying directly west of the Canaries, so to the Canaries Columbus steered his fleet, and then set forth westward into the unknown. By a fortunate chance, it was the very best route he could have chosen, for he came at once into the region of the trade winds, which, blowing steadily from the east, drove the vessels westward day after day over a smooth sea. But this very thing, favorable as it was, added greatly to the terror of the men. How were they to get back to Spain, with the wind always against them? What was the meaning of a sea as smooth as their own Guadalquiver? They implored Columbus to turn back, but to turn back was the last thing in his thoughts. An opportune storm helped to reassure his men by proving that the wind did not always blow from the east, and that the sea was not always calm. But there were soon other causes of alarm. The compass varied strangely, and what hope for them was there if this, their only guide, proved faithless? They ran into vast meadows of floating seaweed, the Sargasso Sea, and it seemed certain that the ships would soon be so entangled that they could move neither backward nor forward. Still Columbus pushed steadily on, and his men's terror and angry discontent deepened until they were on the verge of mutiny. Various plots were hatched, and it was evident that affairs would soon reach a crisis. One can guess the admiral's thoughts as he paced the poop of his ship on that last night, pausing from time to time to strain his eyes into the darkness. Picture him to yourself, a tall and imposing figure, clad in that gray habit of the Franciscan missionary he liked to wear, the face stern and lined with care, the eyes gray and piercing, the high nose and long chin telling of a mighty will, the cheeks ruddy and freckled from life in the open, the white hair falling about his shoulders. Picture him standing there, a memorable figure, whose hour of triumph was at hand. He knew the desperate condition of things. None better. He knew that his men were for the most part criminals and cowards. At any moment they might rise and make him prisoner or throw him overboard. Well, until that moment he would hold his ship's prow to the west. For 20 years he had labored to get this chance. He would rather die than fail. And then, suddenly, far ahead, he saw a light moving low along the horizon. It disappeared, reappeared, and then vanished altogether. The lookout had also seen it, and soon after, as the moon rose, a gun from the Pinta, which was in the lead, announced that land had been sighted. It was soon plainly visible to every one, a low beach gleaming white in the moonlight, and the ships hove to until daybreak. In the early dawn of the 12th day of October, 1492, the boats were lowered, and Columbus and a large part of his company went ashore, wild with exultation. They found themselves on a small island, and Columbus named it San Salvador. It was one of the Bahamas, but which one is not certainly known. Columbus, of course, believed himself near the coast of Asia, and spent 2 months in searching for Japan, discovering a number of islands, but no trace of the land of gold and spices which he sought. One of his ships was wrecked, and the captain of the third sailed away to search for gold on his own account, so that it was in the little Nina alone that Columbus at last set sail for Spain. It was no longer a summer sea through which the tiny vessel plowed her way, but a sea swept by savage hurricanes. More than once it seemed that the ship must founder, but by some miracle it kept afloat, and on March 15, 1493, sailed again into the port of Palos. The great navigator was received with triumphal honors by Ferdinand and Isabella, and invited to sit in their presence while he told the wonderful story of his discoveries. Wonderful indeed, yet what a dizziness would have seized that audience could they have guessed the truth, could they have guessed that the proud kingdom of Spain was but an insignificant patch compared with the vast continent Columbus had discovered, and upon which a score of nations were to dwell. The life work of the great navigator practically ended on that day he told his story to the court of Spain, for, though he led 3 other expeditions across the ocean, the discoveries they made were of no great importance. Not a trace did he find of that golden country, which he sought so eagerly, and at last, broken in health and fortune, in disfavor at court, stripped of the rewards and dignities which had been promised him, he died in a little house at Valladolid on the 20th of May, 1506. He believed to the last that it was the Indies he had discovered, never dreaming that he had given a new continent to the world. Yet is his fame secure, for the task which he accomplished was unique, never to be repeated. He had robbed the Sea of Darkness of its terrors, and while those who followed him had need of courage and resolution, it was no longer into the unknown that they sailed forth. They knew that there was no danger of sailing over the edge and dropping off into space. They knew that there were no dragons, nor monsters, nor other blood-curdling terrors to be encountered, but that the other side of the world was much like the side they lived on. That was Columbus's great achievement. To cross the Atlantic, perilous as the voyage was after all a little thing, but actually to surmount the wall of bigotry and ignorance which, for centuries, had shut the West away from the East, to surmount that wall and throw it down by a faith which rose superior to human belief and incredulity and terror of the unknown, there was the miracle. Many there were to follow, each contributing his mite toward the task of defining the new continent. Perhaps you have seen a photographic negative slowly take shape in the acid bath, the sharp outlines first, then, bit by bit, the detail. Just so did America grow beneath the gaze of Europe, though 2 centuries and more were to elapse before it stood out upon the map clean-cut and definite from border to border. First to follow Columbus, and the first white men since the Vikings to set foot on the North American continent, which Columbus himself had never seen, were John and Sebastian Cabot, Italians like their predecessor, but in the service of the King of England, and with an English ship and an English crew prophetic of the race which was, in time, to wrest the supremacy of the continent from the other nations of Europe. They explored the coast from Newfoundland as far south, perhaps, as Chesapeake Bay, and upon their discoveries rested the English claim to North America, though they themselves are little more than faint and ill defined shadows upon the page of history, so little do we know of them. And just as the New World was eventually to be dominated by a nation other than that which first took possession of it, so was it to be named after a man other than its discoverer, an inconsiderable adventurer named Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine, who accompanied 3 or 4 Spanish expeditions as astronomer or pilot, but who had no part in any real discovery in the New World. He wrote a number of letters describing the voyages which he claimed to have made, and one of these was printed in a pamphlet which had a wide circulation, so that Vespucci's name came to be connected in the public mind with the new land in the West much more prominently than that of any other man. In 1502, in a little book dealing with the new discoveries, the suggestion was made that there was nothing rightly to hinder us from calling it, the New World, Amerigæ, or America, i.e., the land of Americus, and America it was thenceforth, one of the great injustices of history. Since it had to be so, let us be thankful that it was Vespucci's first name which was selected, and not his last one. Meanwhile, the Spaniards had pushed their way across the Caribbean and explored the shores of the Gulf, finding at last in Mexico a land of gold. World worn, disease racked Ponce de Leon, conqueror and governor of Porto Rico, struggled through the Everglades of Florida, seeking the fountain of eternal youth, and getting his death wound there instead. Ferdinand Magellan, man of iron if there ever was one, seeking a western passage to the Moluccas, skirted the coast of South America, wintered amid the snows of Patagonia, worked his way through the strait which bears his name, and held on westward across the Pacific, making the first circumnavigation of the globe, a feat so startling in audacity that there is none in our day to compare with it, except, perhaps, a journey to another planet. Magellan himself never again saw Europe, meeting his death in a fight with the natives of the Philippines, but one of his ships, with 18 men, struggled south along the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and so home. Half a century was to elapse before the feat was repeated, this time by that slave trader, pirate, and doughty scourge of the Spaniard, Sir Francis Drake, who followed in Magellan's wake, and pausing only long enough to harry the Spanish settlement in Chile and Peru and capture a Spanish treasure ship, held northward along the coast as far as southern Oregon, and then turned westward across the Pacific, around the Cape of Good Hope, and home again, where Elizabeth, in spite of Spanish protests, was waiting to reward him with a touch of sword to shoulder. The muse of history smiles ironically when she records that Drake's principal discovery in the New World was that of the potato, which he introduced into England. Not until Drake's voyage was completed was the vast extent of the North American continent even suspected, although its interior had been explored in many directions. Hernando de Soto, with an experience gained with Pizarro in the conquest of Peru, and succeeding Ponce de Leon in the governorship of Florida, marched with a great expedition through what is now South Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia, and came out at last upon the Mississippi, only to find burial beneath its waters, while the tattered remnant of his force staggered back to Mexico. Francisco de Coronado, marching northward from Mexico in search of the fabled seven cities of Cibola, found only the squalid villages of the Zuni Indians, after stumbling on the Grand Cañon of the Colorado and marching as far north as the southern line of Kansas. Jacques Cartier, following another will-o'-the-wisp to the north, and searching for the storied city of Norumbega, supposed to exist somewhere in the wilderness south of Cape Breton, found it not, indeed, but laid the foundations for the great empire which France was to establish along the St. Lawrence. And Henry Hudson, in the little Half Moon, chartered by a company of thrifty Dutchmen to search for the Northwest Passage, blundered instead upon the mighty river which bears his name, explored it as far north as the present city of Albany, and paved the way for that picturesque Dutch settlement which grew into the greatest city of the New World. He did more than that, for, persevering in the search and sailing far to the north, he came at last into the great bay also named for him, where tragic fate lay waiting. For there, in that icy fastness of the north, his mutinous crew bound him, set him adrift in a small boat, and sailed away and left him. So, by the beginning of the 17th century, the New World was fairly well defined upon the maps which the map makers were always industriously drawing, and so were the spheres of influence where each nation was to be for a time paramount. The Spaniards in the Gulf of Mexico, the Dutch along the Hudson, the French on the St. Lawrence, and the English on the long coast to the south. But in all the leagues and leagues from the St. Lawrence to the Gulf, nowhere had the white man as yet succeeded in gaining a permanent foothold. CHAPTER III. William Tomcho.